Today I'm going to be showing you the best Barbarian build, the best leveling Barbarian, and it even transitions into an amazing endgame Barbarian that lets you screen clear and take on every piece of content in the game. It's really that good and it's super easy to set up. It eventually will leverage a lot of the new uniques and a couple of new aspects that make the build completely unstoppable. Things like the aspect of anger management and other things like Ariat's Bearing can make this build honestly extremely overpowered and extremely fun to play. First, I want to walk through kind of how the build works before I get into how to set it up, whether for the early game or the end game. It's a very easy setup overall. Ideally, the main build runs through Whirlwind and spawning our infinite Dust Devils through things like the Fierce Winds, the Devilish aspect, and the Dust Devils aspect, all of which will spawn Dust Devils doing an extreme amount of damage. Now, early on, the Dust Devils aspect, if you can get it for Dust Devils spawning with your Whirlwind, is going to be one of your primary things you want, as well as the aspect of Fierce Winds. So when you cast Shouts, you actually spawn Dust Devils that way as well. Having those two early on really help the Fury management issue until you get to around level 30, 40, or 50. Now, we're also going to leverage a couple of other things. We're going to leverage the aspect of anger management here. This is going to be our primary aspect. This allows us to keep our berserking forever and infinity, which is extremely OP and overpowered this season. So once you get your Fury management issues under control, we stay berserk, meaning we get the constant 25% increased damage bonus and the 15% increased movement speed forever, as long as our Fury stays up that high. A couple other things like the Starlight aspect helps us keep our Fury management in place, especially early in the game. So having this or vocalized empowerment is very good for keeping our Fury. And then we'll just be using regular pants, which I'll have in the guide in the link in the description. You can just use regular pants, but if you get Ariat's Bearing, this is going to take your build to the next level, especially leveling up to 100. Why? Because this takes our Call of the Ancients and makes it insane. So we're already doing a ton of damage with Call of the Ancients, which I'll explain in the rotation, but with the Ariat's Bearing pants, we're reducing our Call of the Ancients cooldown by up to 32.5%. We're getting a ton of resistance to all of our elements, which helps us level even faster. Then we get the ultimate damage bonus, and then obviously the damage bonuses for our actual Call of the Ancients themselves. This takes it to the next level, doing a ton of damage, allowing you to even one or two shot some bosses just from casting this ability. Now, the other great thing is eventually I plan on testing putting Call of the Ancients cooldown reduction instead of Warcry cooldown reduction. A lot of these builds will use Warcry cooldown reduction to allow us to cast Warcry much quicker for that additional 10% buff. But if you don't do that, you still get the Berserking bonus, which is mainly what we're casting it for our big damage. So you don't necessarily need Warcry cooldown reduction. Instead, use Call of the Ancients, because if you can get 22.5% on all of these pieces, that means you can reduce your Call of the Ancients cooldown by 60% before even masterworking these pieces. And then again, 32.5% here. We'll find out if you can infinitely cast Call of the Ancients. And again, we run around at super speed, spam casting our Whirlwind, dishing out tons of Dust Devil damage and tons of Call of the Ancient damage for bosses. It's literally so fun to play, and that's what makes the build amazing. So first, I want to run over some of the abilities and skills in this build. The first thing is going to be we're taking a Lunging Strike. We're going to take this into Battle Lunging Strike for the additional kind of first couple levels. And then we want to take Whirlwind into Furious Whirlwind. What I would recommend is taking Violent Whirlwind early on. It allows you to channel Whirlwind so you can spin non-stop. Once you start getting a higher level, around maybe level 70 or so, you can switch over to Furious Whirlwind, primarily so that way we can proc our bleeding without needing any extra aspect or anything like that. Because when we proc our bleeding, as you can see here from some of our gear, we're going to use the Iron Blood aspect so we get damage reduction from enemies around us that are bleeding. Then we'll take Imposing Presence and Martial Vigor for the health and damage reduction, Rallying Cry obviously into Tactical Rallying Cry for the Fury generation, Challenging Shout into Tactical Challenging Shout, again for extra Fury regeneration and the overall DR. Then we'll be taking Warcry for all of the damage bonuses, as well as proccing Berserking. But keep in mind, once we get the aspect of anger management, we can keep Berserking non-stop. So until then, this is something we'll be spamming obviously a lot. We want Booming Voice and Raid Leader for the healing and extra shout skill effect durations, Swiftness for our speed, Resistance for the damage reduction while Berserking, which we'll get non-stop again, and Fury Generation, which again we will also get non-stop now. We're then going to take Pit Fighter and Slaying Strike for some of the additional damage. thick skin, and then counter offensives into Supreme Call of the Ancients, so we're dealing the max amount of damage, which we will then stack into infinity. It is going to be amazing. Heavy-handed 3 out of 3, so we get extra damage with 200 weapons, and this is multiplicative critical strike damage and wallop, so that way skills using bludgeoning weapons deal 15% increased damage if the enemy is stunned or vulnerable. And then finally unconstrained, so we increase Berserking's maximum duration by 5 seconds and increase its damage bonus to 60%, giving us non-stop massive damage buffs. Then for our gear, you don't need any uniques. You can use regular pants, and I have all that in the link in the description. Everything included in this build, explanations, everything is in the link in the description on Mobalytics. So for the gear for this build, you don't need any uniques. I just happen to have one in this build, and I won't touch on the stats because since we're leveling, the stats don't totally matter. But again, all that stuff is in the description if you want to focus on the stats as you get higher level towards the end game. So for the helmet, we want the Steadfast Berserker's aspect, so that way we gain Fortify whenever you deal direct damage while berserking. Once we get our aspect of anger management, we're berserking every second, which means we get Fortify forever. So that's a big one, and you want challenging shout cooldown and crowd control duration. Then for our chest, we want the Iron Blood aspect, so we gain that 3.6 damage reduction for each nearby bleeding enemy with our Furious Whirlwind perk. Once we switch over to that Whirlwind passive, again, you want challenging shout cooldown here, and also having armor on just one of your pieces will get your armor buff basically to its cap once you're high enough level. You can also take another aspect to bump your armor up early on, making you pretty cheesy early on because you have maxed armor. Then we want the aspect of anger management, so while you're above a certain fury, you are berserk, meaning we'll be berserk forever, getting that max 25% damage buff and increased movement speed, making this a super good end game and leveling aspect. Then we want the Wind Striker aspect, so that way we can increase movement speed for our critical strike. Additionally, having things like Warcry and a greater affix of movement speed on this make it even better. For our weapons, we're going to be using the aspect of Fierce Winds, so that way we spawn Dust Devils with our shouts, but it also causes our Dust Devils to do an extreme amount more damage depending on how big our Dust Devils are and their size, which can cap out at a total of 100%. So you want this on your two-handed bludgeoning weapon. Things like Fury on Killer, great for early on, max life and strength. And then your tempers for chance for Dust Devils. This is important to cast twice, so that way you get more Dust Devils and more damage, and critical strike damage as well once you're able to temper. Now for our two one-handed weapons, we're going to want the Devilish aspect on one, which is going to generate Dust Devils for every 100 Fury that we generate, which is great once we have our Fury management completely under wraps. You also want chance for Dust Devils to cast twice on this, as well as critical strike damage again. And then for our other one-hander, we want the accelerating aspect. This is going to help us spin and do our Whirlwind much quicker. I think it's very helpful early on, and this aspect isn't that hard to get. Plus, you can get Dust Devil damage on here and critical strike damage tempered as well. And again, this is going to help our attack speed, help our Whirlwind speed, and help us cast more Dust Devils. Also, for our two-handed slashing weapon, we're going to use the Dust Devils aspect, so that way our Whirlwind actually leaves behind Dust Devils, and this is great. Once you have this, once your shouts are actually on cooldown early on, this is going to allow you to keep casting Dust Devils at a consistent rate. And again, for the temper tier, we want Dust Devil size, so that way we're increasing the size of them and the damage according to our Fierce Winds aspect, and critical strike damage tempered as well. Again, strength, max life, and something like resource cost reduction or Fury on Kill would be perfectly great for this, and you can throw emeralds in all of these. Additionally, for your ring, you want the Bold Chieftain's aspect, so it reduces our shouts very quickly. That's a must-have. Attack speed and critical strike chance are going to be great for your rings, as well as things to resistance like all elements. Now, keep in mind, one thing you do want to temper on these is Call of the Ancients cooldown reduction. If you can get that and temper this on all of your jewelry pieces, that's going to help you out tremendously, get you to level 100 very fast. So also for our other ring, again, we want critical strike chance where we can get it, and again, Call of the Ancients cooldown reduction, but you do want damage while berserking on one of these, so that way we're maxing out our glyph, that way we're maxing out our legendary node, which I'll show you in a minute, to make sure we're getting the most out of our damage. And then for our amulet, we want to get a critical strike chance, cooldown reduction, and movement speed is great as well. And here we want the aspect of elements, because these elemental damages are multiplicative and they can stack with our Whirlwind and Dust Devils to give us a ton of extra damage very quickly. And early on, you ideally want diamonds in these so you can max out all your resistances if you have trouble meeting them. Now keep in mind, an early necklace you can get on by doing the seasonal quest line is this Lokran's Talisman. Now you'll get this from actually doing the seasoned quest line, meaning we get resistance to all elements, but we get the big critical strike damage here, and we also get an insane critical strike chance boost up to 18% crit strike chance. Once you get this amulet from the seasonal stuff, you can throw it on. That's a big buff that can get you all the way to 100 very easy without really ever having to worry about anything. Then for our two-handed expertise, we're going to be using the two-handed axe expertise, so we can take advantage of the 10% multiplicative increased damage. That's going to be some big damage for us. Then I'll show you the Paragon board. Once you get past level 50, I'll just hover over the board really quickly, in case you need to see any of them in particular, and you can just pause this, or you can again check out the link in the description for the build. Ideally, we're taking the first board, we're taking the exploit board. You may need to swap out a point or two to reallocate to get some of these early on boards up and going, so that way you meet the requirements. But the first board we take every single time is the exploit board, so that way we are proccing vulnerable on enemies, so that way we're doing a lot more damage to them up front. You have to put this as your first board, so that way you're maxing out how much damage you can do early. Next, we'll take the Blood Rage board, and we'll take the Twister Glyph here. You want to take this second. Some boards have it a little bit later, but taking it second guarantees you big twister damage very, very early, especially around like level 60 or so. So make sure to take that second and max out these strength nodes here. Make sure to max out these strength nodes so you get the most twister damage possible. It really helps early in the game. And with this, if you kill a bleeding enemy, you get a 10% chance to grant berserking for 5 seconds, which is great early on before you have anger management, and even after, and also giving you up to that 30% damage bonus while berserking, which is huge. You want to take the Warbringer board, and we'll just take the Ire Glyph, so that way you get increased damage while berserking, and you take 10% reduced damage from elites while berserking, which again will be proc non-stop once we get the anger management aspect. For the fourth board, we'll take the Carnage board, and we'll take Might. Might's going to give us increased damage with two-handed weapons and additional bonuses to some of these other nodes here. Then for the fifth board, we want the Bonebreaker board, and we want the Wrath Glyph. This makes it so skills that critically strike generate 3 Fury. We'll be generating a lot of Fury because remember we have Locrian's Talisman that makes our critical strike chance go through the roof. Then we want the Decimator board with the Disembowel Glyph. So when we kill a bleeding enemy, we have a chance to add to our berserking, but now we also have a chance to reduce cooldowns of our non-ultimate active cooldowns, meaning we can get to our shouts, hence Dust Devils a lot more. Then the legendary No Decimator, so you get increased damage each time you make an enemy vulnerable. And then finally the Flawless Technique board. Nonetheless, you just take the Martial Glyph. So after casting a shout skill, the active cooldown of every other non-shout skill is reduced by 2 seconds. If you want, you can slot the Martial Glyph earlier. And as you can see here again, this is currently where I'm at on my board with all of those boards in mind. I'm only to here, but I'm still just running through every piece of content, well over level 120 enemies, already at level 80. Then for a rotation, ideally we're going to want to use our shouts early on when leveling, so that way we can again proc our Fierce Winds aspect and cast Dust Devils on top of enemies just by calling in our shouts. And you can essentially stagger these, so you can use one shout like Rallying Cry. Once you move over to other enemies, you can use your War Cry. Once you move over to other enemies, you can use Challenging Shout. And then they will regen one after another, so you can just continually casting shouts on new enemy packs, so you can clear them faster, help you to level up a little bit more. Again, our Lunging Strike we'll use early, and after you get level 100 or you find you're never using it, you can replace it with something like Iron Skin, which I'll cover in the endgame build. And then our Whirlwind, where you can cast it and hold it consistently. Early on, I recommend you just channel it and hold the skill, so you just run around and spin around the entire time. But as you get your Fury management under control, you can start spamming it, creating a little more Dust Devils and more damage. But again, the big thing is early on making sure you stagger your shout cast, so that way you're clearing out packs of enemies with Dust Devils by casting one shout. This is going to help you level very quickly until again you get your Fury management completely under control for your build as you level.